I had a really cool question the other day. I thought it was a really good question on YouTube, and if you haven't noticed, I try to respond to every YouTube comment, and I know that gets into the hundreds per some videos, and it's really, you know, labor of love. I spend about an hour a day answering YouTube comments, 365, 7 days a week, and I appreciate all those comments, so keep them coming. One of the comments was about buck bedding, and this viewer had found a really good buck bed out in the woods. He was scouting in southern Michigan, and in this buck bed there's about 30 saplings around. They were all rubbed up, and they found a little mound in there where there was an obvious bed and there was nothing else around. And he asked a really good question. He said, how can I duplicate this? And duplicating buck bedding and habitat and try to create that goes back to, and I'm not saying about this viewer, but you know, going back 20 years, there's been that fad out there that you can create some certain conditions. In fact, someone used to tout 7 secrets of buck bedding, and you create this. And I know one individual even told James Kroll one time down in Texas that if he did this out in the Texas brush the right way, it would attract a buck to that location, nothing else being said. Trying to duplicate buck bedding where bucks bed, certainly a really cool activity for habitat, whitetail habitat on your land. But I want you to think about this spin a little bit different. The viewer asked, how can I duplicate this? And it all goes back to not the habitat features of a buck bedding. And of course you have to have a flat area. Usually there's high stem count surrounding, but it's not about the habitat. It's certainly not an overhanging branch or overhead canopy that you develop. That's all fad stuff too. What is real and what you find, and what I scout whitetails for a living. It's what I do. And when we're finding buck beds out in the woods, it all boils back to the positioning of where that buck is at, not the habitat features. So we're standing in one of our food plots right here, and I've talked about this a lot, but I think it's so important, and there's a trail coming down behind me. We have a redneck blind over there. We have redneck ghillie blind over there. And we've shot a buck back here. Jake shot a buck back here. We shot does on this plot. This is a really cool spot. We leave this alone other than sending a bullet in here, but we try to never spook a deer. And this food plot, the food plot over there, food plot down there, they start to establish where bucks bed. It begins with these food plots. Because if you don't have these food plots and you don't have that daily movement, then the buck bedding is random at best. And what I mean by that is this food establishes the daily afternoon patterns of the deer herd, and you want that to consistently stay strong the entire hunting season. Buck bedding starts with food. The reason for that is because if we have this food here and we have this cover over here, whether we work on it or not, if it's thick enough, we don't need to. If it's not thick enough, depending on the habitat, we might hinge cut, we might have a timber harvest, we might add switchgrass if it's open fields. There's a lot of different ways to create doe bedding. Doe bedding is the most important. So we have this food. Does and fawns want to bed consistently daily next to their afternoon food source, and that'll be, like in this ag country, it'll be within 50 to 100 yards. And we can go back in here and there's benches with does and fawns. I'm sure we just spooked them out by coming back here and making this video in early August. We really don't care about spooking them right now because the mature bucks are out in these ag fields. They're not going to come on this property. We have a few mature buck sightings, which is awesome. I love seeing them. They're random. But we want those bucks coming on the end of September through the end of October, not right now. Because usually if you have bucks right now, you don't have them later. But you have food, you have doe and fawn bedding, you have young buck bedding, and then you have the opportunity for buck bedding. And a lot of times it doesn't matter the type of habitat. If he can find his own space up here on a bench, doesn't matter if it's hardwoods, if he's hidden from the wind, if he's protected from the wind, if he's protected from other deer, he finds a reclusive spot, then he's gonna bed there, and that's where you're gonna find buck bedding. Pretty easy to find buck bedding looking at an aerial map in your area. Because if you have large ag on the south side of 100-acre woods and habitat area, and on the north end of that woods and habitat, there's more woods, or there's big open fields that are unplanted, fallow fields where there's not a lot of hunting activity or deer activity, then you're gonna look at that, and you're gonna go to the north end of that 100 acres, maybe in the center, and work north, and you're gonna find that buck bed. When I work with the hunting public when I show up in early October, and we're going to hunt some small public lands in Michigan somewhere. I can't release that yet. I don't think so. I don't think anyways. But I'm going to look for those features where you have big food sources, you have public land, and how can I get in with a canoe or bat access, some way, hard access, where I can get on that back end of that cover where there's a chance of a mature buck holding and being in that area. So don't think about the habitat as much. I have a client who has 80 acres in Buffalo County. He does really well with a lot of mature bucks, up to 6-7 years old. And what's interesting is a lot of the middle-range bucks, middle-aged bucks, does and fawns live on his property. Switchgrass, lots of food plots, lots of bedding areas, lots of hinge cutting, lots of regeneration, hardwood regeneration, the perfect fall-winter property. And what's interesting, a couple of his mature bucks have lived on the neighbor's 160 acres. It's open hardwoods, and they're back there with no improvements, but they're on that property because a lot of stress on his property, a lot of deer, mature bucks, and that's at one spot where a 6-year-old can go slide off by himself and be by himself during the day and not be bothered not only by people or hunters, but other deer. He has the perfect scenario where he has food. He has that bedding next to the food. He holds a lot of does and fawns. He holds a lot of middle-aged bucks. He holds a few mature bucks. But some of those old giants actually stay off his property in those open hardwoods. And what would appear to be something you'd never want to copy, you know, getting back to the original viewer's question, that you never want to copy this and say, okay, we need open hardwoods for mature buck because that's where this one's bedded. He can go back in there. It's hill country. He can get out of the wind. He's protected. He's away from people, away from does and fawns, away from the stress of what the normal herd accepts on a daily basis. And it all began by creating food, like this food plot here, having that layer of doe bedding, and then that buck somewhere behind there. If you're looking for buck beds this year, if you're scouting for buck beds on public land or private land, if you're looking to create buck beds, don't put the cart before the horse. Make sure you have food first. This food needs to be screened, which it is, and then that allows those does and fawns to bed as close to food source as they want to, and then there'll be bucks back there. On a small parcel, it's critical. Try to sandwich those layers as tight as you can with high quality improvements, starting with the food plot and the doe bedding. And hey, you might not even have to worry about buck bedding if you have those other layers first and you have enough cover left over that provides adequate buck bedding. You don't have to mimic what you find in the woods on your land. You have to make sure you find these layers first, establish this, and it's not, again, about creating the perfect buck bed habitat, but instead creating the perfect buck bed positioning to allow that buck to be there in the first place. If you're scouting for them on public land this year, if you're trying to create it on private land, enjoy it. Finding a buck bed, creating that buck bed opportunity is one of the most sacred forms of deer habitat and deer positioning that you can find in the woods. And that's my number one thing when I'm looking at client properties, work at these mature bucks bed. A lot of times if you have a big food plot in the middle, you just don't have space left over for that buck. But if you can find it, create it, scout it, look for it this season. I love buck beds, love finding them in the woods, and I think you will too. And if you think about positioning, you'll be on the right track for finding a lot of buck beds this fall.